Hello and welcome to Narrative Drivetime, a show where we talk to storytellers about storytelling. If you're in the storytelling business or want to be, you need to listen to this show because you're going to learn a lot. I'm Craig Colby. I've been telling stories as a television producer for 30 years in all genres. And right there, that is Sonya Buyting. She is a science journalist. She is a television and radio producer, and you can learn a lot from her as I have over the years. So stick around. We're going to tell you about that right now. Sonya, welcome.
Yay! Hello, Craig. It's good to be here.
It's great to have you here. I have worked with Sonya in several capacities over the years. She's one of my absolute favorite people to work with in the industry. And let's just start with Sonya. What are you doing in the industry right now?
Right now, I am a producer for Quirks and Corks on CBC Radio, and I've been there since about 2015 now, and at CBC Radio since 2015.
And so in your role there, you are doing science stories every day, all day, which is like your dream come true.
It is. It really is. Like every day, this is where my brain wants to be. It wants to be in science stories. Like I just love riding the wave of like the edge of knowledge, right? Like the edge of knowledge for anybody on this entire planet. And so it's super exciting to be able to do all science every day. And Quirks and Corks is just like the place to be here in Canada at this point. It's actually the only place to be when it comes to broadcasting and science for now.
Well, yeah, for not too long ago, it had a companion, which we both worked for. But before we get into the nuts and bolts of the storytelling, which you know a ton about, tell us a little bit about how do you get to be a science journalist?
Well, I was doing my science degree at the University of New Brunswick, and I was taking chemistry, biology, and I was the head demonstrator for a biochemistry lab. And I really loved teaching concepts and breaking down complicated ideas for students in tutorials. But I knew I had a really short attention span. So I knew that I wasn't going to be a teacher because I don't know if I could do the same curriculum year after year. And I actually went into science thinking, I'm going to go to medical school. I'm going to be a doctor, like almost everybody who goes into science. And then it quickly dawned on me that, you know what, I don't know if I really want to do that every day. At the time, I kind of glommed on to the focus of, that means I'm going to be hearing people complain all day, every day. And I don't want to do that. And I know it's a lot more than that, but that's kind of where my mind went back then. And so I fell in love with biochemistry, and I had a really inspirational teacher who just, made it come alive. And so I thought, well, maybe I want to do research. Maybe I want to become a scientist. And so I worked in a lab one summer, and I can't deal with that pace. I need fast pace. And so because I love teaching so much, one day somebody said the word journalism to me, and it kind of it went in one ear, got stuck, and it's been stuck and embedded in there ever since. And so from there, my boss in the biochemistry lab knew Paul Lewis, who was then the executive producer of At Discovery Canada, which was the daily science magazine show on Discovery Channel. And so I got in touch with Paul, and he said, sure, come visit. And I was in Toronto that year for March break, and I visited him. He's like, sure, come intern with us this summer. So that was back in 1996. And interned at Discovery Canada, and then went back, finished my science degree, got my journalism degree, and then I started, when I was doing my journalism degree, I was working at CBC Newsworld, and from there I went out east and got some really hands-on, great experience in a smaller market at CBC in Charlottetown, at CBC Radio Charlottetown, and then I went to a private radio station in Summerside, Prince Edward Island, where I was part of a two-person newsroom We were covering the entire island, doing the provincial reporting, municipal affairs, and everything else. And I was reading the news in the afternoon. And every night I would host a show for a half an hour. And from there, I went back to CBC in St. John, New Brunswick. And then that was the fall of 2000. And I moved to Toronto because I knew that that's where I wanted to go and where I wanted to be, and applied for a job at Discovery Canada and got it. And that was the start of my real hands-on science broadcasting training. And it was awesome. It was like the best boot camp imaginable.
Well, yeah, you said a couple things that really resonate with me there. I mean, the first is the short attention span. I mean, one of the reasons I got into the media is you have to prove it every day. And I knew that I was easily bored and I needed something that challenged me every day where everyone saw my work, so that if there was a shortcut taken, you'd be called on it. The other thing you talked about was, I remember your internship. I was at Discovery Canada from its.
You were there. I met you then.
I remember your internship, and I remember you coming back, and we worked together there. And then I had left Discovery Channel and went off to be an independent producer, and then was hired by two of my favorite bosses at Discovery Channel and TSN, where I previously worked. And they were starting their own broadcast entity. They had 4 HD channels. And one of the first people that I hired was you.
I love that. I brag about that all the time. I was one of the first. I think I was actually the first hire.
I think it was Barb.
From Discovery Channel.
From Discovery Channel.
Yeah.
And I want to show people just one picture. I just got that off of your Facebook page. And if people want to know why I love working with Sonya Buyting so much, that is the inside of Sonya every day at work. Is just that enthusiasm and just attacking the work and just showing up every day. So that is.
I love what I do. I really do love what I do.
It shows. So let's get into the nuts and bolts and the nitty gritty. Science journalism is its own particular beast. It's usually very complicated stories, often without good pictures, often very conceptual. What is the key to telling science stories?
You have to make it relatable. It has to be something that it's either relatable or really like a big, far out wow or quirky story that gets your attention. And if you're not able to sell that to an audience who doesn't have a background in science, then you're not doing your job, or you're not picking the right stories, which is part of doing my job right. And so I look for stories that excite me, my favorite kind of science stories are people stories, like, because of my biochemistry background, the more detail I can get like that, the better. Although that is one of the things I've had to learn through this whole process, is that the details, you can't tell all the details. You can't get into as much detail that I find fascinating. And so that was a real challenge for me when I started producing science stories, is to let go of some of those details, because, the viewer wouldn't be able to follow along with that. And so, yeah, it hurts to lose those details. Nobody's going to care about where the electrons go. So, you got to kind of keep it at the surface to a level where everybody should hopefully be able to follow along with it.
Well, I mean, that's one of the, especially in television, even more so than radio, because you have less time, is you can't put it all in. You got to leave something out, or they won't watch, or it won't get to air. I had one item not get to air one night at TSN because I was putting too much stuff in. Just no way it could work.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, the shorter, the better, and the more succinct, the better. I remember there was one story at Daily Planet that I did about the science of meditation when the Dalai Lama had visited Toronto, and I actually got to meet the Dalai Lama and ask him a question. Really kind of got in his face when I did that. But anyway, maybe that's a story for another day. We can get into that later.
I may have to follow that up. Go ahead.
But when I was doing this story, I remembered there was this a really interesting bit that I thought was like super important for people to be able to understand why meditation is so great. And once I put the piece together, that bit, I think, made it weaker. And it just didn't fit into with the tight narrative that was everything else in that piece other than that bit. So even though I really wanted to include it, I really shouldn't have. And it's that gut reaction, like I kind of knew that I shouldn't include it, but I was like, no, I'm going to do the public a service and put it in. No. You can't do that. You got to make it tight. You got to keep really tightly to the focus. And so, yeah, that was a lesson I learned then. And I try not to have to learn lessons twice.
Well, nowadays you put those little sidebars on the web since everyone wants web content.
Yes.
There's neat little tidbits that last about a minute. That's actually a really good place for them, or even tweets promoting the material.
Absolutely.
So obviously you need something that is of general interest. People stories help a lot. Certainly having a good communicator does most of your work.
That does almost all the work right there.
When Mike Krzyzewski, a basketball coach, started his own team after working with the great coach John Wooden, he said, what do I need to know? And he said, get the best players, right? So if you get the best talkers, that's most of your work done right there. It's just shaping it. So you've got a good talker, you've got something that has an engaging hook to it, something easily relatable, and current is often the best relatable thing. Certainly any COVID-19 vaccine story right now is going to be an attention getter from the time we're recording this.
I would argue with that a little bit, because we've been seeing vaccine coverage. It can't just be any vaccine story. You got to come into it with some kind of unique angle or hook, just talking about vaccines, because everyone's talking about vaccines, like I feel like it needs some sort of new angle. Like if I were doing it today, I would be talking about this Russian vaccine that they're trying to rush through. I feel like the time to do a general vaccine piece has kind of passed us.
No, I agree with you. But what I'm saying is, even putting vaccine out there perks your ears a little bit, right? Because that's what everybody wants. You can't just do another general vaccine story. But so once you got that hook and that relatability and that new angle, what's the latest thing? What are some techniques you can use to make the story understandable?
Well, one thing that, you want to make it conversational. For radio, you also really want to make it conversational. And I have a 9-year-old son, and occasionally when I'm walking him to school, or back prior to COVID, when I was walking him to school and I had a story, I would try to tell him and say it and tell him in such a way that I would get his interest. Or sometimes I think about my mother and trying to tell her, or my father, to get their interest. These are people who do not have any kind of science background, but because they're around me all the time, they have to listen to it. And, I can tell when they're interested, and when they're interested, that's the sweet spot, right? But so I just work it out, like I just try to imagine, how would I tell someone this if I was going to tell them about this cool story for the first time? And I talk it out.
What about comparisons? What about comparisons?
Oh,
Are
yes.
those helpful?
Now, those are very helpful. If you're working, talking about some really difficult scientific concept, then sometimes, if like a picture comes to mind that is relatable, like some kind of metaphor or analogy, those always help. Bob McDonald, the host of CBC Quirks and Corks, he is excellent at coming up with these metaphors. Like, I think he's a really visual thinker. So he's always able to kind of say, oh, I've kind of got this idea. It's like this, right? And he describes some kind of scenario that puts a picture in your mind. And it's like, yeah, it is kind of like that. And so, yeah, though, whenever you can come up with something like that, that definitely helps to try to illustrate a difficult concept. Absolutely.
Yeah, one of my favorite questions, I think I learned this from one of our mentors, Penny Park, was, what's it like? What can you compare it to? And when I was doing a show called The Sex Files, and we had a lot of conceptual things, that was often the visuals I would shoot over somebody saying it. I would do a visual comparison. And here's an easy one. When we were talking about impregnation, we had a woman in an inner tube at the end of the pool and the U of T swim team at the other trying to get to her. So, I hope I don't have to draw a picture for what that is, but it was a
Yes,
very fun way to illustrate. Pretty
absolutely.
visual thing anyway.
That they're my favorite documentary that I've ever seen. It was one that came out a few years ago, and it was stunning. They were trying to do exactly that. They were trying to show how difficult it is to impregnate a woman. And the way they did it is they had people dressed up, like they had people all in white, and they shot them running across the prairies and running across sort of like, and you had this image of these sperms having to travel halfway across the country. And then they have this obstacle and then this obstacle. And if they can get by, but they were illustrating this with like people in like white suits. Like it was beautiful. And it was like, visual. Wow, this is so amazing. So it was like as if Cirque du Soleil had produced a documentary about how sperms get to eggs.
Great. So the basics of people need to know are find a good guest, find an interesting hook, find a way to visualize it for people with comparisons, ways to make it easy.
Absolutely. And that's for radio. And when with TV, you do get to, show a bit more, but you sometimes don't get to show it as, science is difficult because normally when we're reporting on something, it's something that had been done a long time ago. And so, how are we going to show something that is not happening at that time? So visual metaphors, they work in television, but they also really, really work in radio.
Yeah. Helping people draw it in their mind. Certainly like a Higgs boson story would be very hard in television if you don't have a great graphic for it, which often you don't.
Yeah.
Preparing guests. We talked about guests. Very few emerge full formed. A lot of them take a lot of work. And when they do work, everybody goes back to them. When you are taking somebody who hasn't done many live interviews before, how do you coach them?
Well, I'm going to take this a little step back even further. I did some science communication training where I was actually like working with and physically in the same room with scientists and trying to help them, coach them to be able to deliver, what they're researching a bit better. And I think, scientists know their material and where they often stumble is when they start thinking about their material and how other people are going to interpret what they're saying, because it is like there's a huge culture of peer review in science to make everything better. But, when you're interviewing someone, talking to a scientist who is thinking about what his colleagues are going to think or her colleagues are going to think, it makes them stumble often. And so I remember there's this one scientist, and she is now a communication superstar. And she had what is called like a message box where she had written out, what is it that I'm trying to say? Why is this important? And a few other main points. And she kept trying to think back to her notes. And I was telling her, no, you got to own this. This is your work. You know this better than anyone else. Don't be thinking back to your notes. You just tell me what it is that you're doing and deliver it and just do it. You got to own it. And so that's one of the biggest things that I think scientists, it could help them to know is that you're the expert. I want to have like what will sound like an off the cuff conversation with you. And I want you to sound like you're, not thinking about how you're going to be judged. I just want you to have fun and be enthusiastic. There's a reason why you've been studying something for so long. It's because you're really passionate about it. Show that to me.
Well, that's to me the real key in any interview is somebody delivering it with passion. And it's the reason I don't give anyone questions ahead of time. And I'm going to show you why. I think I can actually demonstrate it. The way you were talking about it now, you were fully engaged, and we've done a pre-interview. You knew we were going to talk about this, but I didn't tell you what the question was, because I knew when you knew the topic, you would be here, you would be presenting it. But if I gave you the question, you might think, I'm going to write down especially if you haven't done this, I'm going to write down the answer. Here's the question. I've been waiting for it. All right. I remember I was going to talk about the message box. There's a message box, and people can go through it, and it tells them what's interesting and what's new. And then you give that information. And once you're remembering and thinking back, you're not here, you're there.
Yeah.
So that's, I think, an important thing for anyone is learn it, don't memorize it.
Absolutely. And even when it comes to numbers, if numbers are important, I don't need to know the exact number. If you just tell me it was ginormous, I get the sense, it's a big, big number that we're surprised about.
And I'm always leery of media training. The right media training is great. The get on the message track media training isn't. And there's one that we talked about in our pre-interview. I'm not going to say the name. There were 2 Canadian astronauts. One is a celebrated communicator. You can probably figure out who it is. I won't say who the other one is. But when you talk to them, the one who was smart guy had the media training, and you could tell he went into the training. I know I'm supposed to say this, so I'm going to say this, and I'm using modulation, modulating and changing my voice, and this is how you're supposed to present it, and it was not exciting. Whereas the other celebrated Canadian astronaut just told you interesting things, like going on a spacewalk. He said, you're still weightless in that suit, so you have to wedge yourself in when you're repairing something or working the equipment. You come out and you're covered in bruises. You go, wow, was that ever fascinating? Yeah. So it's a matter of being interested in saying interesting things more than just being eloquent.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that is the conversation, that if you were going to overhear those 2 astronauts talking in a bar to their friends, that is what you would actually hear. You wouldn't hear the other bit where it's all very proper and delivering exactly what has to be said. And I think one of the best things that anybody can do if they want to improve how they communicate is record yourself. It's uncomfortable, it's not fun, but record yourself and watch it back, and it helps a lot. I was shocked by how many times I say, you know what I mean? It becomes plainly obvious when you play yourself back.
Yeah, I force myself to watch these. It's not because I love it.
No.
And I don't. The other thing I'm going to throw out there for anybody in science communications is don't try to sound smart. This is actually true for everyone. Don't try to sound smart. And I'm going to give you a football example. The 2 best football color people, the ones who give you the analysis, are Tony Romo and John Madden. And what makes them different than everyone else is they tell you things about the game that you want to know, but they don't deliver it like a thesis. The worst guys, I can't even listen to them. It's like they're doing their doctorate on the 3-4 defense. And they're using all these big words. I don't believe them. Yeah. But the ones who actually tell you in the language that they talk in, they not only automatically sound smarter because smarter things are coming out of their mouths, they sound more relatable.
That's the key to broadcasting. In print, a really smart way of saying it, or a really, smart, a really long word that it could work in print. It doesn't work in broadcasting, because because we're used to talking things out, and talking when you actually write out what you say looks vastly different than what a magazine or print article would look like.
I think you should even write like you talk. Mm-hmm. It's the number 1 rule in communication. I have 4 C's and a 5th one if you can do the other 4. But the first one is clear. You need to be clear. If it's not clear, you've wasted your time. Let's talk about radio.
Okay.
You've done a lot of radio. I started in radio. I was in there for 4 months. I did not like it. I don't think it liked me much either. But let's talk about how you put a successful story interview on the radio. You've worked at The Current, Quirks and Quarks, and Q.
And Day 6.
Day 6.
Yeah.
You talk about the
and What on Earth. Sorry, another one.
You need to put them all on your website.
So today, sorry.
Can you walk through the different philosophies that they have regarding their interviews?
Sure. So the Current was an incredible place to go because all of their stories, which they call parts, are anywhere between 17 minutes and I think 27 minutes. And so that's a good chunk of time. And so what you have to do for working at the Current, it's a very challenging thing to every single morning come in with an idea for a fully formed part. And so this fully formed part has to have a news hook, and you have to have a focus statement, so somebody is doing something because of a reason. But also you have to have an idea, okay, so how do I want to roll out this part? Who do I want to tell the story, and what kind of format do I want it to take? And so then every single person that they have within that part has their own focus as well. And so it's such a wonderful exercise to be able to, figure out how to put together features. And that's something that we started doing at Quirks and Quarks a few years ago, that they didn't used to do as much of. And so now every single week we try to put together a feature that ends up being, 13 to 18 minutes long. And that experience at the Current really helped me to be able to do that, because then I get to, imagine, okay, so what's the best piece of tape I can get for this story? And also, like, how would I roll this out to all fit within one focus? Because it's got to be tight, and if it's not, then it's not going to work. And Q was very different. I found that very challenging, because I don't have an arts training, and for me, science stories are very logical. It becomes very clear how they have to roll out, because you want to get someone's attention, and then when you have their attention, then you give them the context they need to be able to understand the story. Then you roll out the story, and you get to why it's important, and then some kind of nice pithy wrap up. And Q stories are very different. So the focus statement at Q would be, we're going to talk to somebody about X, because all artists have their products, right, that they're making, their artistic products. And that's the only reason why we would talk to them, is if they had something new out. And so we're going to talk to somebody about X and what it means about Y. And so that what it means about Y has to be the bigger theme. If there's no bigger theme, then there's really not much ground to, get into a deep conversation with them on. And also, so the bigger theme is, you have to relate it to the product that they're doing, their intention of what they were doing, and also, implications as well. And so, I think that's a really nice way to do a focus statement for something like that, where it's not as, ABC logical always. And day 6 and Quirks and Quarks, we don't really do focus statements, although for Quirks, they always help when we do have a really tight focus, especially with features, because then it's a few things coming together to make a nice package. One thing about science stories and Quirks and Quarks and discovery-based stories is that these are all mysteries that have been unraveled, so they're natural stories, like there was a reason why the scientist wanted to look into this, and then, through their scientific method, they investigated this, they probed this. Sometimes things don't work. And so, and then they get to the conclusion, and wow, there's a story narrative right there.
Yeah, in both cases, what you've come back to is the why. For the artist, the why. Why did you make this outside of, it's been 2 years and I've been working on this album and I want to put it out. One of my favorite artists, Bruce Springsteen, every single one of his albums has a why to it. And you say with science, why did you look into this? Because that's when it gets personal, right?
It gets personal. Sometimes it's more about, well, I saw this, we found out that X happened, so it made me wonder about why, so it's personal in that this is a passion of theirs, but sometimes they don't always have like an actual personal relation to what it is they're looking at, especially if it's something a bit more nebulous. But their passion is always extremely personal. And there are actually, now when I was at Daily Planet, I was trained for one very tight story structure when it came to interviews. And at Quirks and Quarks, I sometimes do it that way, but I sometimes do it in a completely different way. And I'll just describe it. So with Daily Planet, because we also had a shorter amount of time, so it had to be done a lot more succinctly. And this way is an easier way to get at a story when you have little time. And that is getting the headline statement right out of the gate, right? And get the scientist to say, well, I discovered that da 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 da. Right? And then, oh, well, how did you discover it? Well, why did you want to look into it? What does this mean for X? And so that's a really tight interview right there. But sometimes with Quirks and Quarks, I purposely, if I have a little bit more time, and sometimes a minute is all I need to be able to do this, is the first question isn't a headline statement about what you found, but it's, why did you want to look into this? And then, well, how did you even do that? Well, what does this mean? And so what did you find? And so what does this mean in the bigger picture? So it's kind of like the inverse, in terms of the interview structure. And I find it works better when you do have more time to be able to get at that intention. And that helps, it's good when there is a good intention in there and a good motivator for why they did their work. If it's, not that interesting, then I will often go to the other kind of format.
Well, that's the value of the pre-interview, right?
Yeah.
If they have something personal or surprising off the top.
Yeah, absolutely. And the very first question I always ask scientists when I start the conversation is, why did you want to look at this? Because I want to get that.
Right. Sonya, there's so much more I wanted to talk to you about. So we're going to have to do this again sometime. But I do want to ask you one thing, because when I hired you at High Fidelity and you were primarily a host, and I would have to give you feedback on that. Now I'm trying to do what you have done successfully for so many years. Any tips for me on hosting so that I can get better at this?
Craig, I knew you were going to ask this question. And this is the one question that you told me you were going to ask. And honestly, we went through our rehearsal, and you're so, you're talking to me right now the way I would be talking to you if we were hanging out at a bar. And so you've already got that.
Which we have done.
Which we have done a few times. Absolutely. But yeah, you already do that. And, you don't speak too fast. You don't, we're engaged. I honestly don't have anything for you, Craig. I told you I would try to come up with something, but I don't, because you're very personable right now. I mean, I would suggest maybe find a different backdrop.
You know how hard I worked for this backdrop. Well, I'll see what I can do, but I'll tell you right now in Pandemicville, we have 4 people in the house in different spots, and this is the one I could isolate. And looking the other way, it ain't any better.
Yeah, no, I hear you. I got a bed in the background. What are we going to do, right?
Yeah. I kind of like the background. I got Neil Armstrong over here. Got K-Line.
I wonder if maybe because there's one area that's kind of blank, and maybe if you had your back more to the corner, if that might be just a slight bit nicer.
Sure.
But you got to get that Neil Armstrong picture in for sure.
Oh, it's Buzz Aldrin.
Oh, yeah.
Picture. Here's one little bit of space trivia. There is no photograph of Neil Armstrong on the moon because he had the camera. And,
oh, wow.
Well, there's apparently some tension there, but Buzz Aldrin always said, well, we were so busy. But come on.
That's something that Bob McDonald would know. Absolutely.
Hey, can you take a picture? Let me take a picture of you on the moon. You'd think that'd be number one. Anyway, the only picture of Neil Armstrong on the moon, the only photograph, is reflected in Buzz Aldrin's visor.
That is so cool. I had no idea.
I spent a day with Buzz Aldrin, and he signed that for me. So that was his guy for a day. That's another long story.
Nice. Do you want to hear my Dalai Lama story?
Yes, I want to hear the Dalai Lama story.
So he was in town. He was doing this big thing at the Sky Dome. It was the Sky Dome back then, I think. And I got to go to that, and it was awesome. It was really incredible to be there. And then afterwards, there was a press conference. Actually, I think it was on a different day. And so, tight budgets at Discovery Canada, Daily Planet, and you didn't have a lot of extra time for shooting, but I was adamant that, I need to get to this press conference. I need to ask the Dalai Lama a question. And so I was able to go out with a camera person and leave the office specifically for this press conference. And I had been in communication with the press person throughout the week. And she assured me, absolutely, you can get your question in at the press conference. And I'm in there and, he's taking questions. And the way they had it set up is there are two groups of journalists, and on each side there was one person running around with microphones to hand it to the whoever's going to be speaking next. And every time I raised my hand, but I wasn't worrying too much because I was assured I'm going to get my question in. And then all of a sudden I saw the Dalai Lama kind of look to his assistant. He kind of looked at her and kind of gave her a nod, and then he slowly starts to get up, and he says, oh, no, he didn't get up yet. Somebody said, and this will be the Dalai Lama's last question. And I was like, and it wasn't me. And I hadn't got the microphone yet. And I turned around to the press person who was right behind me. I'm like, but you said. And she's like, sorry, there's nothing I can do. And so I was like, oh my God, I can't go back to the office and have taken a cameraman, a freelance camera person out for the day and not have this question. What am I going to do? What am I going to do? And then he finishes his question and he gets up and he's like, thank you very much. And I just jumped up and I was like, Sonya Buyting, Discovery Channel, one more question, please. And he was like, okay, for you, one more question. And he sits back down, and Chris Gargas is in the back, and he's like scrambling to just start rolling again because he had turned the camera off when he thought the press conference was done. And I got my question in. I asked him, I was like, so what does it mean to you to have your Buddhist traditions and principles proven by science? And he's like, well, when it comes to quantum physics and cosmology, we've had to revise many texts based on what we're learning in science. But when it comes to science of the mind, Western science, very, very young, like kindergarten. And it was a beautiful clip, and I loved it. And I was so happy that I got it in. And I got a lot of actual pats on the back by journalists all around me for getting that question in before I left. And so, yes, I stood up and I interrupted the Dalai Lama once, but hey, I got my question. That's what you got to do.
And you know why you got that question in? Because the Dalai Lama was up against this.
Totally. He didn't stand a chance. I was not going to let him leave that room without getting my question.
No, the Dalai Lama had zero chance when he was faced with that. Sonya, thank you so much. There's more we wanted to talk about, so we're going to have to do this again sometime because there's some really very practical storytelling techniques for building a script, and I'd like to have you back to talk about that. And I think I'm going to dig a few other people up who are good at that, who have different techniques, so we can go through this for people. But thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and your experiences with us. Truly such a joy to work with all the time. I'm a big fan of yours. I tell people that all the time. So thank you very much for sharing your thoughts and your time with us. And I'll think about the background. I already had to change my shirt for my brother. He gave me that pointer. But thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us today. And we'll talk again soon.
Thanks, Greg. Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Are you a storyteller who wants to tell the story of how you tell stories? Yes? Then I want to hear from you. Drop me a line at craig@colbyvision.net and tell me a little bit about yourself, your career, and some of the particulars of your process. Colby Vision is a storytelling company working in the broadcasting and the business world. Send me an email if you need help with either. Thanks to Tim Vesely for the music, and Kevin Francisco for the graphics, and Dave White for the editing. And thanks to you for watching Narrative Drive Time.